So now let us get into the next one, getting data from web server logs to HDFS. And for this, we will use a source called exec, a sink called HDFS, and a channel called memory. And we will see details of these three as part of the documentation. So when you go to the documentation, if you want to set up locally, still you can go through the setup process and take care of it. But I will pass on, and I will directly get into configuration. Okay. And as part of the configuration, you can see there is a section for Flume sources, and then Flume sinks, and then the channel which will connect this source and sink. So these are the main categories. And here, when you go to the source, it supports several sources. You can get data from Euro source, which is nothing but a web service which send Euro messages. You can use thrift source to get certain information from web services in the form of REST APIs or something. exec source, JMS source, so on and so forth. Okay. But most importantly, to get data from web server logs, we use something called exec source. Okay. And if you click on any of the sources, one of the common property is type. Type will tell what type of source we are running. And earlier, when we talk about netcat, for the simple example, there's a netcat source, and you can go there and you can see for netcat source also there is a type, and then there are two more properties which are in bold, because netcat as a source starts a web server within the source itself. As the web server requires IP address and the port number, bind and port are also mandatory properties. That's why bind and port are in bold. But all the common property between all the sources, sinks, and channels is type. Okay, for netcat it has to be netcat. For exec it has to be exec. And let us go back to the exec. Okay. So let's understand what exec is. Exec is to primarily issue a command onto a file to get the data in streaming fashion. If you are familiar with shell scripting or shell commands, there's a command called tail which will get last few lines. If you want to get the data in a streaming fashion using tail command, we can actually say tail -F. So typically when we use exec as the source, we will issue this command called tail -F and the file name, so that Flume as the agent keep on reading data by issuing this command at regular intervals. Okay, so that is the purpose of exec. That's as we have to issue a command, there is the additional mandatory property which is command itself. So type and command. And then there are other properties like batch size, timeout, etc., which you can explore and understand a bit in detail by practicing if you want. But to begin with, we can leave it as leave them as defaults, and we can say type and command to get the data from the log files which are generated by your applications, and then we can actually push the data to target sink through channel. And our problem statement says we want to get the data from web server logs to HDFS. As we have to get data from web server logs, we have to use exec as the source and start reading data from the web server logs, which I will demonstrate a bit later. What is that web server logs and how to get the data from that using exec, and all will be covered a bit later. First, let us go to the theory part of it. As we are done with source, now we can go to the sinks, and sinks have HDFS sink, Hive sink, Logger sink, which we have already seen, Euro sink, where you actually pass data to a web server running accepting Euro messages, thrift sink, so on and so forth. There are all these things which are supported. But for the certification purpose and most of the projects purpose, we will be predominantly focused on HDFS sync. And when it comes to HDFS sync, it is primarily to write events to the Hadoop distributed file system. As we already see in HDFS, the main thing for the sync after type is the path. You have to tell to which path we have to write the data to. That's where HDFS path comes into picture. And we will see those things in action a bit later. So for now, just explore the theory. And then there are a number of properties like file prefix, file suffix, means what should be the name in the beginning of the file, what should be the name in the end of the file. You cannot hardcode the files completely. HDFS path, you have to pass the directory. And to customize a bit of details for your file names, you can use prefix or suffix. And then how frequently the files should roll is controlled by these three properties: roll interval, roll size, roll count. And I will explain all those things as we get into the implementation a bit later. On top of HDFS, we also have HiU and many other things. Let me go to this index. In the configuration, you can see the list of things here. So whenever you get a requirement, you just go through these things and it will give you details what are all supported, and then you can proceed further. If nothing is there which supports your problem statement, then you might have to extend the existing Flume code by customizing as per your requirements. Once you have source and sync, there's a channel in between. So instead of passing one message at a time between source and sync, the channel will actually queue up the data into micro batches, and that batch of data will be passed on to the sync at regular intervals. And that's where the channel comes into picture. And you can see different channels are supported. You can use memory channel, you can use JDBC channel, Kafka channel, file channel, etc. Here we are primarily interested in memory channel because as part of our problem statement, we want to get data from web server logs into HDFS through memory channel. And the alternative is to use file. These two are the main things which we'll be using. And again, type says memory. And then what is the capacity of this what is the capacity from the memory that needs to be allocated to this channel, and what is the transaction capacity, which is nothing but maximum number of events the channel will take from a source or give to a sync per transaction. So typically capacity will be higher and transaction capacity will be a bit lower, but by default it is 100, but typically the capacity will be higher. So at any point in time, channel can hold on to so much capacity, but transaction capacity is the one which will actually define the maximum number of events the channel will take from a source or give it to a sync. Here it's maximum, so it can go up to that amount. It's not that it will wait until 100 messages reach so that it actually process as a transaction. It is the maximum number. So if you are pushing a lot of data at a given point in time, probably it might reach this threshold and it might start complaining that maximum transaction capacity or capacity is reached. These are maximum number of events at a given point in time that can be held within memory. Okay, so these are the properties which we need to understand and define for our problem statement, which is get data from web server logs to HDFS. Source has to be exec because we are trying to get data from web server logs. Sync has to be HDFS. Channel can be memory or file, but we are using memory. And if you go to the file channel, which is another important one, memory, JDBC, Kafka, file channel. Here you can see the transaction capacity will be much bigger and capacity will be much bigger, because here we are using file. File is a lot more reliable but will be slower. It is almost like memory. Only thing is, we'll be using a file as intermediate layer between source and sink, which can which is a bit more reliable but slow compared to memory. So if you have to define a reliable way of transferring the data, you have to choose file, but it will be a bit slower. So we'll be using file a bit later, but for this problem statement, we'll be primarily focused on memory. That being said, as we understand exec source, HDFS sink, and channel memory, let's start defining the configuration file, and then we will actually run it as an agent.